And so what we're going to be talking about here is we're going to be utilizing the basic daylight exposure wheel to calculate our exposure. So this will work in all situations. So it's a great way to kind of familiarize ourselves with the function between the ISO, the f-stop, and the shutter speed, so that exposure triangle that we talked about yesterday. And also it's a really great way of starting to understand equivalent exposures. So the whole premise of this wheel is based on this concept of the sunny 16 rule. So the sunny 16 rule states that if it's sunny, then we can use f16 and the shutter speed and the ISO will always match. So they'll be equal. So the way that the wheel works, so if I take this initial dial and I slide this around, what we're looking for is for this one here where it says ISO, that little notch, to display the ISO that's going to be set to our camera or the film if we're using a film camera. Because before we can start to tell the camera which f-stop and shutter speed is going to correct, we need to know first, well, how sensitive to light is the camera? So in this case, ISO 100. So we set that first. Then you can see that this wheel has been based on that sunny 16 rule. So we should notice that these numbers on the inside here are all of our shutter speeds. So the shutter speed 100 will match our f-stop 16, right? So we've got 100, 100, f16. So that's our sunny 16 rule. Again, ISO 100, f-stop 16, shutter speed 100. So that would be the correct exposure if we were outside and it was sunny. The great thing about the wheel is it also lets us calculate all the possible equivalent exposures. So equivalent exposure just means that it's the same amount of light, just a different way to get to it. So just to kind of make sense of it, think of kind of a exposure, the optimal amount of light for a given situation. Equate that, let's just talk about it as if it was a bucket, right? So if I have a 5-gallon bucket of water and I want to fill up that 5-gallon bucket of water, there's lots of ways I can do that, right? I could get a hose and just pour it in and it'll go really quickly. I could get a 1 liter or a 1-gallon container and I fill that up 5 times and that'll give me my 5 gallons. If I was doing it with cups, I'd have to come over and give it, 16 cups to every single gallon, and just keep filling it up. Eventually I'll get there, right? But if I do it with cups, it's going to take more time. If I do it with teaspoons, it's going to take even longer to fill up that bucket, right? So the same sort of thing's happening if the container is small. So if I have a really small opening that's letting only a tiny bit of light into the camera, well, then it takes more time to get the same amount of light. If I have a really big opening that lets in lots of light, well, then it's going to take less time to fill the bucket, right? Or fill up the correct amount of exposure. So this is giving us all of these different equal exposures. So I could use f16 at 100, or I could use 5.6 at 800, or I could use 32 at a 25th. All of them will give me exactly the same amount of light into the camera. They're just different ways to get there. Okay? So that's the first thing that our wheel does. The other thing that the wheel does is it allows us to calculate the exposure if it's not sunny, right? The sunny 16 rule is based on if it's sunny, then f16, 100, 100. So there's lots of situations that are known, right? Because it's based on this given quality or quantity of light, right? So the sun has a certain output. Well, when the sun's not there, like if it's in the shade, or if it's overcast, or if it is, at nighttime, there are known kind of exposures for those as well. So we're going to focus on just a couple of them. The first of which is this one here, which is overcast, heavy, or open shade. So open shade is a great place to shoot, to take portraits, because the light's really soft and even. So we'll do a lot of shooting in open shade. So just kind of commit this one to memory. So open shade, there are 3 stops, less light in open shade. So we need to give it plus or more exposure by 3 stops. So the way that that's going to work on our wheel is, notice it says over here, plus more, needs to go in this direction. So what I want to do is I want to rotate the wheel. So I'm going to start always with my ISO, which is at 100. And I'm then going to rotate the wheel 3 stops. So the way that I usually do it is I'll look here at whatever shutter speed is lined up here, because this gives me the most amount of movement I can possibly do. So I'm just going to keep an eye on this 13 and I'm going to move it 1, 2, 3 f-stops. So I'm just going to change the dial 1, 2, 3 stops. So I've now offset the wheel by 3, which gives me longer exposure times than what I had before. Notice before at f16 I used to have 100, which is now all the way over here. So this is a slower shutter speed. It's going to be a longer length of time, giving me more light, right? Because it's going to be darker there. So now again, all of these exposures could be correct. They'll all give me the same amount of light. So if I wanted to stay at the 100, well, I could shoot at f5.6. If I did shoot at f16, well, then I could shoot at a 1/13 of a second. And if I was at f32, I could shoot at a 1/3 of a second. All of them will be correct. It's just different combinations. Now, as we go through the next couple of assignments, we'll talk more about why would I want to choose this situation versus that situation. Okay. But that would be the correct exposure for shade. Now, if I'm going to calculate a different lighting scenario, I always want to reset based on my camera. So I'm going to come back to ISO 100 because my camera is going to be set to ISO 100. So then the next thing that we need to do is to start to adjust for a different lighting condition. So the other one that we use a lot in class is going to be this one here, which is interior kitchen +8. So our classroom lighting, it's got overhead fluorescence, kind of banks of 6 lights. And so that's the most similar to the setup of a kitchen. You know, interior den could maybe work too, but that's a little bit more like kind of tungsten spotlights or wall sconces or, you know, like a desk lamp sort of a thing. So we're going to go with this one that's +8 stops. So what that means is once I've started off at ISO 100, I'm then going to shift my wheel by 8. So again, I'm going to start here looking at this 13 and then move 8 around this way. And again, I like to start here so I have lots of room to move in this direction. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So I end up stopping at 2.8 at a 1/13 of a second. Okay. So again, any of these combinations are equal, right? They're all equivalents. So I could pick any of them. They're just going to give me different effects, right? I could shoot at f32, and I would be required to use the shutter speed of 10 seconds, right? And again, these little quotation marks indicate that these are full seconds. So that would be a 10-second exposure. If I didn't want my exposure to be quite so long, I could do something like f11 at 1.3 seconds. Or I might be able to do something like 5.6 at 1/3 of a second. So if I had a lens that did have an f-stop as low as f2, I could use 25, right? But again, if we want to make sure that we're writing down exposures that we can actually use, again, I would try to stay above the 5.6 just for right now, unless you know for certain that your camera is able to go lower than that. So again, any of those exposures could be correct. It's just a matter of what the directions are going to ask you to do. So that's kind of how we're going to function our wheel. Again, every time we're going to start off at 100. Now, there might be lots of times that we might want to vary that. So the way that we would vary it is if I did set my camera to a higher ISO. So let's say I was going to shoot inside the classroom, but I needed a really fast or a faster shutter speed because I couldn't handhold it at a 1/3 of a second. I forgot my tripod or something. So I could increase ISO. I might want to start maybe over closer to, let's say, 1600. Now, at 1600 on our camera, it's a much higher ISO, but we're still not actually picking up much noise at that point. And we'll talk more about that when we look at the ISO project. But so if that was my starting point, notice up here, f45 is lining up with a 200th of a second instead of 13, but that's okay. So what I'm going to do then is, if I'm still shooting inside the classroom, I still need to do interior kitchen +8. So I'm going to look here at f45 and 200, and I'm going to move it 8 stops. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So now my 200's all the way again over to 2.8. But all of these exposures are now the correct exposure as long as my ISO in the camera has been set to 1600. So I could shoot at 5.6 at a 50th of a second. As long as my focal length is shorter than 50th of a second, I should be able to handhold that without there being any blur. If I was to shoot at f11, I still probably am going to get a little bit of blur. If I could get my camera down to f4 by zooming out, I could shoot at a 1/100th of a second. So this is going to increase my exposure so that the shutter speed will be much faster if I needed to be able to handhold it. So that's how we would do it if we were doing an ISO other than 100. Anytime you finish, it doesn't matter what ISO over here says now. We only care about this window when we're starting the exposure time. We base our exposure off of that initial ISO, and then if we need to change anything else like offset the wheel, then the ISO isn't going to indicate anything. Okay, so that's how we're going to use the wheel. For the assignment, you're going to be looking at 5 different scenarios. So what I want you to calculate is for each of these situations. So the first one's asking full sun, and then I want you to choose a section that's in medium depth of field. Sometimes it'll give you a lighting situation like this where it says open shade, but then it wants the fastest possible shutter speed. So what we mean by that is, again, if this is full sun, we don't have to offset the wheel at all, right? This is designed for sun. So any of these could be correct. So we want to choose one of these 2 that fall within that area of medium depth of field. Now, and so I'll choose one of those 2. I probably would choose f16 at 100 just because that's our basic daylight sunny 16 rule, and just to see if it worked. Then if I move to open shade, again, that's 3 stops. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3. And then these would be the correct exposures. Now, when it asks for fastest possible shutter speed, this could be a little bit confusing. So what I mean by that is, this is the fastest shutter speed our camera can do, 6,400th of a second. But we can only use the fastest shutter speed that has a usable combination of f-stop and shutter speed. So this one, there's no f-stop over here that can possibly give us enough light in order to use that one. So that one's out, that one's out, that one's out. Now, this would actually be the first possible combination, right? 800 at f2. But if my camera won't go to f2, I can't use that either, right? So earlier I was telling you, well, just to be safe, go ahead. We know that our camera for sure will use 5.6. It might be able to do f4, but if you're not zoomed in or out at the right spot, you might not be able to get that. So to be safe, let's just stick with 5.6, right? So the fastest shutter speed I could possibly use is a 1/100th of a second, because it's the only or first combination that I have that I know for sure my camera will allow me to do. And it's faster than all the other combinations, right? That one's 50, 25, 13, and so on. So that's the fastest shutter speed we can possibly use in the shade if we started with ISO 100. Okay. So do the same thing for the other ones. Figure out the exposure if we were inside with expansive depth of field, a backlit subject where you're exposed for the shadows with shallow depth of field, inside the classroom with the fastest possible shutter speed. So figure those out, write down those combinations, then grab a camera, and on your camera, make sure that you're shooting in manual mode. Make sure that you've gone in and set the ISO. So you'll go menu, you'll go camera menu, and if you scroll up from the bottom, it'll be the 4th from the bottom, it'll say ISO sensitivity. You'll choose that and make sure that it says 100. Also make sure ISO auto is turned off so that it can't override what you're doing. Also be a good idea, double check your camera settings so that you know image quality, make sure there's not already pictures on there, and double check exposure compensation by holding the +- button and make sure that it's not already been set to override the exposure by a stop or 2 before shooting. If you plug in these combinations and you go into this lighting situation, you should have a great exposure. Okay? Good luck. If you have any questions about that, best thing to do, rewind, go back, review a section of it just to ensure that you have full understanding, because we will be using the wheel for the next 4 assignments. So it's a good idea to take some time, really kind of get a good grasp of how to use that, and then you'll be able to go out and in any situation determine the correct exposure using your basic daylight exposure wheel.